Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Criminal Justice Natters with me, Ed Johnston. Today, we are joined by Dr. Tiddy Smith, who has recently published a book called Death by Talons. The book is all about the Kathleen Peterson, Michael Peterson sort of murder investigation. And in particular, we look at Larry Pollard's owl theory, and Tiddy goes into some detail about whether or not what happened in that incident on the 9th of December in 2001. So let's get it with Tiddy. Good morning, Tiddy. Well, good morning for me. Good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining me this morning to discuss your book, Death by Talons, which is related to the Michael Peterson case that's centered in the Netflix documentary, The Staircase. How are you?
Oh, I'm very well. As I just mentioned before this interview began, it's a lovely time of day for me to have an interview. Whereas when I'm being interviewed, I live in Jakarta in Indonesia. So when I'm interviewed from the States, I normally have to wake up at 3 a.m. or something ridiculous just to make contact. So absolutely lovely. The sun's out. I can see out the window. It's great.
Excellent. Great. So your book that recently came out around the owl theory and the staircase, sort of in a nutshell, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I guess obviously, I had seen the Netflix docuseries only a few years after it came out originally. So this was before Netflix. That we're talking about 2004 was when it was first released, and I think I must have seen it around about 2006, 2007. And of course, I thought it was a really exciting and interesting story. But at the end of the documentary, as I think most people felt, I sort of felt that the evidence was not very compelling for the idea that Kathleen had fallen down the stairs and that this was what had caused her death. Like most people, I thought, well, on the balance of probabilities, Michael probably did this. But then word started to get around about this owl theory of Larry Pollard. And in fact, you have an interview previously with Larry that I'm sure people can look up if they want to. And Larry put forward this theory that actually what had happened to Kathleen Peterson was neither a murder or a fall down the stairs, but an owl attack. And of course, that struck me as an incredible theory because it was so outrageous. What could be the prior probability of such an event occurring? Who's ever heard of such a thing? But the more I looked into the evidence and the more I sort of looked at, say, the autopsy photos, some of the crime scene photos, I realized, there's actually quite a bit to support this theory. How interesting. But then I was discussing this case one day with a stranger who really troubled me about this owl theory, because I just mentioned, Larry came up with a pretty good theory, though, didn't he, about what might have happened to Kathleen. You have the wounds on the back of her head. They look just like these trident marks, like bird tracks, and you have the feathers, broken feather fragments that were found in her hands. Well, how could you explain this? And this person who I was talking to, who was more skeptical, just said, look, have you ever seen a cat with a bird? Feathers are all over the place when a serious attack like this happens, especially if, say, there's any kind of struggle between the object attacked or the animal attacked and the attacking bird. And this troubled me, obviously, because, well, it's simply true, right? I mean, if you are tussling with a large bird of prey for any prolonged period, there are not just going to be a couple of microscopic feather fragments attached to her hands. There's going to be at least, say, one large, I'd imagine, pile of whole feathers around the area where this tussle took place. And that's when I realized that no matter what you thought about the owl theory or anything else, there has to be more to the story. It can't simply be, as Larry thought, that you have Kathleen attacked by a swooping bird of prey outside on the path, which then sort of detaches and flies up back to the bushes. Kathleen then runs inside and faints in the stairwell. There has to be more to the story for all sorts of reasons that I guess we can get into when we start talking more closely about the evidence in this case. But that's really what inspired the book, just the very general idea that, I'd always thought Larry's theory was interesting, but when I started looking at the evidence, I realized, hang on, that can't even be half of the real story here.
All right, go on. So what was it that you saw in the evidence that made you think, yeah, okay, there's some holes here and this could potentially plug those holes?
Well, I think the first thing that I recognized as important, or in fact, almost like a paradigm shift in this case, really, was the discovery of, in the stairwell where Kathleen was lying, there was a tremendous amount of blood spatter and blood spray and blood shadow stains. I mean, when the stairwell was finally submitted to a forensic analysis, it was found that there were over 10,000 individual blood spots, right? But in fact, all the blood wasn't as central to the case as the other things that were in the stairwell. So in other words, where there was no blood, this was found to be more crucially important to figuring out what happened to Kathleen. So I decided to look more closely at these photographs, crime scene photographs and crime scene video of the stairwell itself. And that's when I discovered that there were white splatter stains over the blood that is sitting on the two bottom steps of the staircase. So this is directly under where Kathleen's head was lying. And here you have marks that, and I've consulted ornithologists about what they think these marks look like. They say, well, that really looks exactly like what you'd expect from a nervous bird. Okay. Now that's that was the first piece of evidence that made me realize that not only had Larry's theory probably been mistaken about where the attack took place. I mean, it may very well have began out on the front path, but it must have persisted inside the stairwell. Now, once you accept that for a sort of cumulative case, you look at the other evidence that supports the idea that this was a bird attack, and then you find the droppings within the stairwell. Then you want to ask, well, hang on, if this is where the tussle took place, which the overwhelming amount of blood spray would suggest, then where are all the feathers? So it's sort of, you get to that point before you want to ask, where are all the feathers? Now, that opened up a terrible can of worms for me, because I realized that we could really appeal to here would be the crime scene video itself. So I can't stress enough how detailed of an analysis I've given to the crime scene video, which was filmed by Dan George, the lead forensic technician on the scene. Now, it's a very poor quality video, and obviously we don't have the original, so we can't submit it to a proper forensic analysis. But there are a couple of things to note about George's video that are suspicious, even before we look at what it represents. So one of the most important features of Dan George's video that make it seem suspicious are that there are numerous scene cuts in the crime scene video. And this is very much against proper crime scene videography practice. When you're filming a crime scene, you do not make scene cuts without at least documenting why there has been a cut in any particular place. So for that reason, it's quite shocking to note that there's around about one scene cut every 30 seconds in Dan George's video. So around about, once you get through the 12 or 13 minutes of footage, there are about twice as many scene cuts as there are minutes of footage. Okay. Over 20 scene cuts. Now, some of these cuts you might think, well, they're not very suspicious because, say, they're cuts between different rooms of the house. So you have a shot of the lounge, and then the scene cuts, and all of a sudden we're looking at the stairwell again. But some of the cuts are very strange indeed, where, say, there'll be a close-up of, for example, say, the doorbell. All of a sudden the scene cuts. When the film resumes, still the doorbell. So it's as though something has been removed from the middle portion for no clear reason. When George is being interviewed about why there are all these scene cuts in the video, he's very cagey about explaining why it was like this. In fact, he doesn't initially admit that there are any seam cuts at all, which is ridiculous given how apparent it is. And in fact, it was the attorney who pulled him up about it. So his own lawyer, so to speak, who said, well, why are these seam cuts here? And Dan George sort of says, well, if it looks like there's a lot of movement when I'm filming, that's because I was moving around the house, and it's because of my movement around the house. He really just doesn't explain why these cuts are there.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing to note. There's certain things that are suspicious about the crime scene video that suggest that it's probably been redacted, and quite heavily redacted. I mean, the other thing to note is that about 2/3 of the house doesn't get any footage at all. It doesn't get filmed, and that includes rooms in which we were supposed to imagine that Michael had collected cleaning equipment and things like this. So areas of the house that were supposed to be suspicious weren't in fact filmed. Now that's just one aspect of the crime scene video that makes it seem suspicious.
Okay.
When it comes to the other aspect, it's rather difficult to put it into words. That's why I've dedicated an entire chapter of my book to outlining how it is that I think the manipulation of the footage has occurred that in fact obscures the apparent fact that there are many, many feathers, not just around Kathleen's body, but also scattered throughout the house.
So you think there were many, many other feathers that were just not ones in her hand and a few in the hair, that there was other feathers in the house as well?
Well, certainly in the stairwell. I mean, that much I think is very, very clear. That if the attack took place here, I mean, even if you just grant it, on the assumption that this was a bird attack, and you grant that the droppings are in fact droppings and not some white splatter of milk or something else. It's important to note, I didn't actually mention that the white dropping marks are over the blood splatter. So we know it had to be deposited there either during or very shortly after this attack. So apart from the feathers that were in the stairwell, which you would expect to be there on the hypothesis that this was where the attack took place, there also seemed to be a great many feathers down the front path, which is where Larry believed the attack had begun. So that fits with Larry's hypothesis quite well. There are certain features of the distribution of what seem to be feathers down the front path that fit this fact as well. So, for example, there are many more of what appear to be feathers, some sort of scattering of leaf-like debris, over the area where the blood drops were found. So that's anomalous if they are simply leaves. So, but if feathers, it makes a bit more sense why the distribution is not random, that you find a greater number of leaves over the areas where the blood drops are. But the more interesting areas of what I believe to be areas where feathers were found are areas within the kitchen where the forensic team had claimed to have found blood drops and blood smears, although blood drops and blood smears that they never photographed, never filmed, and never submitted to a forensic test, never submitted to any presumptive forensic test. Now, these were the famous photographs in the Staircase docuseries, within which we were told about photo glitches. This was quite a famous episode in that documentary. So Dan George, once again, is on the stand, and he's asked, well, here are two photographs. They represent exactly the same place, and they're taken on the same day. One of them shows something that looks like a blood drop on the cabinet door, and the other one shows nothing there at all. So what's going on here? And Dan George's imaginative answer is, I was told this was a photo glitch. Right. Who told you that? I don't remember. What sort of glitch? Not sure. How many glitches? Don't know. And in fact, many photographs depicting the same areas in the house, so double, when you have these photographs of the same area taken on the same day, exhibit the same characteristic. You have photographs in which there appear to be little flecks of something there, and then the next photograph, they're not there. So either something's appeared or something's vanished, between the time of the two photographs, unless you want to accept Dan George's ridiculous explanation that these were photo glitches.
Yeah.
Now, it's my theory that, in fact, these are light and movable feathers. These are downy feathers that have shifted between the time of the two photographs. Why it's difficult to tell that these are, in fact, feathers is the fact that the photographs are of such appalling quality anyway. You really have to see some of them with your own eyes to recognize that these could not have been the result of simply shoddy police skills, shoddy police photographic skills. One of the most interesting things about the photos is that they're almost all sepia toned. They're very, very dark sepia, which obscures any real difference in the color components of the photo. So you really have a hard time identifying that. This is just a fact about optics, right? Once you color any particular scene with red, you do away with the ability to discern very well between colors in the scene. Simply, you could, if you put, say, a red mask, a transparent red mask over some of these photos, it would be very difficult from after that point to know the borders or the delineations of any object within the scene. There are all sorts of features about the photographic and film evidence that are not just suspicious, but really persuasive evidence of manipulation.
Do you think this was manipulation or just ignorance of the feathers, that they didn't think it's a big deal? Or do you think that it's just, this looks cut and dry as a husband's attacked his wife and that's what we're left with?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think what probably starts out happening is a ball starts rolling from very early in the case, before really the scene is submitted to any kind of analysis. And once that ball is rolling in a criminal case, I mean, maybe you can talk about this more than me, I assume that it's very difficult to change the direction of that ball and easier to just go with the flow, especially if you have, say, the person accused of the crime not bringing up the feathers that are any sort of problem as well.
Yeah.
So I imagine what happened here is the scene begins to be analysed. There's a woman drenched in blood at the bottom of a staircase. There's a huge amount of blood around the house. The police turn up and he's saying, she fell, and it's clear she didn't fall. So for them, this is easy. They start the ball rolling. It's within 40 minutes, in fact, of Michael's first 911 call that a criminal investigation is set in process. So once that ball was rolling, I think, it may have been a couple of days before they realized that all of the feather evidence was suspicious. And it may have been a few weeks before anybody put together the idea of a bird of prey attack. I think for quite a while it might have simply been a question of, well, where was the ragged duvet? Where was the torn pillow? Because it must have been somewhere. And only, say, after the autopsy is complete, once you see the shape of the wounds on Kathleen's body, not just on her head, but, say, on her elbows, that's when you really start that. Like with any good theory of anything, these things take time. And I think there just wasn't that time available by the time the ball started rolling. So it was easier, in fact, to manipulate the evidence than it was to, throw in the towel. Because you still need information about what happened, right? Either way. So it's not really going to be any easier. It's just going to get more complicated because now you've literally thrown a cat you've thrown a pigeon among a crime scene.
Absolutely, yeah.
Messed up it's going to become a lot more difficult to figure out exactly what happened. And you're going to start asking other questions like, well, why did Michael not notice any feathers there? And why did Todd not notice in the kitchen walking around? And these are good questions to ask, and I don't think they have answers yet, and we should be looking for answers to these questions.
So so obviously you got access to a wealth of evidence in the case. How else did you research the case? Did you speak to anyone? Did you find anything interesting from people you spoke to?
This case is a very, very difficult one to investigate because of the sheer number of secrets involved. So I managed only, despite contacting the North Carolina, police force, I was given a number of emails for, contacts of officers involved in the case. None of them answered my queries. Well, rather, only one person did, and luckily she was quite an important person in this case. She was the crime scene photographer. So I would have loved to have spoken to her, but only the crime scene photographer, whose name escapes me for this moment, answered my query. But it was very valuable speaking to her. Obviously, I had numerous interviews with Larry Pollard and his lovely wife, Brenda.
Yeah.
Very lengthy discussions that were sometimes extremely enlightening, other times quite exhausting. And I spoke to numerous ornithologists. I actually went out on little field trips here in Indonesia to bird parks to talk about, frequent injuries, raptors, and collected owl feathers to experiment with their, because these feathers are not waterproof like the feathers of other birds. So I wanted to see how they, for example, flicked blood or so did some little mini experiments in the house, that sort of thing. But apart from this, it was really just about interviewing the lawyers involved, interviewing the Larry, obviously, and looking at the crime scene evidence and listening to the entire trial, which is, over 2 months worth of material, which is now entirely available on Court TV. And I think that was the most important bit of work, really, because although I think there are a lot of secrets and lies in this case, it's more about unraveling the contradictions, or rather, unraveling the contradictions between different investigators' stories, for example, is actually a very good way to go about solving some of the issues in this case.
And what contradictions between the different investigators did you find?
Well, I mean, for example, the blood evidence, which is supposed to support the case that Michael staged the scene. So once again, this evidence was never photographed. So this was the luminol evidence, when they sprayed all around the house with luminol to see where the footprints went from Kathleen's body. And they claimed that, I mean, in general, they claimed that the footprints went through into the kitchen and just stopped magically. And that another set went through to the utility room, which then stopped magically. Now, this is really quite unbelievable. It's very difficult to believe that this is what they witnessed. This is like stepping out from a wet swimming pool, taking a few steps, and rather than your footprints slowly fading, they're just not there anymore. But insofar as contradictions go, there were 3 officers on the scene who the forensic sorry, lost my train of thought. The forensic analyst, Eric Campen, was in charge of the luminol test. And he just his argument is, well, there are 3 of us doing this, so we'll all agree when it comes to the trial 2 years later about what we saw. So I don't need to take any notes. I don't need to draw a diagram. I don't need to take any photos. Because there's 3 of us, so we'll all back up each other's stories. But in fact, stories are just, they make no sense whatsoever, apart from the general claim that something kind of went through to the utility room and something kind of went through to the kitchen. The description of what they saw is completely incoherent between the 3 men. The only thing about which they all seem to agree is that there was general motion. So whether it was footprints or shoe prints or scuff marks or anything, there was general bloody movement that they saw going through in one direction and another path going in another direction. And the other thing that they all agreed about was that there was one set of bloody bare footprints that were very clear in front of the kitchen sink. And that's not very surprising, because we know that Michael was standing in front of the kitchen sink when he started washing his hands after finding Kathleen's body, and he did this in full view of the police, who had been in the house for about half an hour by that point. So it was not a suspicious hand-washing episode. This was, oh my God, my hands are covered in my wife's blood. I've got to get rid of this. And he was told to stop by the police, and he oh, all right. And he did. But that's just one
Okay.
example. There are very many
Yeah.
contradictions. Honourable.
When you so we touched on the sort of you speaking to the stranger and stuff. I mean, how long did this book take you to write?
So the writing took around about around about a year, looking close to a year, and the research beforehand. There's a sort of blurry line between what you could call an obsession beginning and what you where I'm actually taking notes and that sort of thing. And that lasted about a year as well. So I think all up we're talking about 2 years of research and writing, which overlap.
So if you spoke to someone, they said, "Oh, what are you up to right now, Tiddy?" And you say, "Well, I've spent the best part of 2 years trying to figure out how an owl could contribute to a woman's death." I mean, that's the reaction, right?
Absolutely, but even worse, that was action from potential publishers and publishing agents. You say,
Really?
well, of course, if they're not
Yeah.
familiar with evidence and how it sits, and you write to a stranger out of the blue and you say, look, I've been working on this book for 2 years. It's about how a woman might have been killed by an owl. And in their head, they're Winnie the Pooh and cute and fluffy and,
Mhm.
so, they're obviously not very keen to engage with this madman who's contacted them out of the blue. And,
Yeah.
what can you say? It's fair enough. You can't really blame these people. But I suppose, I hope that one of the chapters in this book, I've got it here, I can show the audience.
Please
There we
do.
go.
Excellent. Thank you.
Get it today. One of the chapters deals just exclusively with owl attacks in North America over the last 100 years. People just don't seem to realize how common these are. And there's not simply attacks every single year, but serious attacks, life-threatening attacks. And there has been at least one prior fatal attack, which happened in California in 1985. So, I do hope that this changes some public perceptions about owls and what they're capable of. Unfortunately, it also changed my perception, and I now have a terrible fear of owls, which I'm slowly over.
Yeah. When I was preparing for the sit down with Larry, I looked to see, are there similar instances of owl attacks in Europe? And I found that there was one owl in the Netherlands that was responsible for over 50 attacks, according to
Yes,
the Guardian.
I do know that.
And it's just like, heightened hormone levels at the start of the breeding season for them made them more dangerous as well. It's like when you think, when I sit down and think about this, I think this is plausible. And when I first started watching, because I was obviously, for a professional interest in human curiosity, I was fascinated with the show and the case, and I had no idea what was going to happen. I didn't read ahead of it. I just followed it as I watched the Netflix show. And then you sort of think about the owl and it's like, no, that's ridiculous. And then it just sat there and I thought, it might be ridiculous, but it doesn't mean it's not true. And this is fascinating. And I loved your book. And I just think that this is exactly what this particular case needed, a whole sort of book based on this particular theory.
I should mention that, the reason I wrote it is because I wanted to find the book so I could read it. There was another reason. I thought, well, hang on, somebody must have done. Once I found the bird droppings, I thought, hang on, this theory is much bigger than what Larry even mentioned. And I thought, well, somebody's done all this work already. Nobody had. And I thought, good grief. Well, all right then.
So in terms of the bird droppings then that were on top of the blood, is that correct?
Yeah.
How was that sort of categorized or explained within the evidence, or was it not?
Well, I mean, I want to say not, but unfortunately there was an attempt. It's just a very sorry attempt to explain it. Now, firstly, it notes that once again, it was never tested. Let's remember that the prosecution's case was that Michael had cleaned up the scene within the stairwell, that he'd been wiping around trying to get rid of evidence. All of a sudden, let's say, discover these white marks in the stairwell. Well, what are you going to
Yeah.
think? If you're if you're the forensic investigator, you're going to think, is this Ajax? What's going on
Yeah.
here?
Yeah.
Right? No mention of cleaning products, no mention of Michael's involvement. Instead, the prosecution never mentioned it. It came down to David Rudolph, right, the defense lawyer, who pointed to the white in the photographs and asked the forensic investigators, "Look, what the hell are these?" And this was Dan George once again, and he said, "I see a staining there." And Rudolph, not really having any idea of a bird of prey or anything like that in his mind, said, "Does that appear to you how dried luminol, might look, after it's been applied in a reaction?" And George kind of goes, "Oh yeah, I guess it does.
Yeah.
I guess it look like what you'd expect, Lou." Yeah. And then, of course, Eric Campen agrees, but he says, "We never did a luminol test there. Of course not." The thing is, though, is that it's a very unlikely explanation for the marks.
Yeah.
The reason this is it's not simply splats or spots of white over the blood. Some of the substance, whatever it is, has become smeared and mingled in with the blood. So rather than simply white splats over red, we have a pink paste on the stairs in the area where Kathleen's head was lying. Now, to explain this by appeal to a luminol test, you have to remember that, when they... Give me a second.
Okay.
When they spray luminol, it's something like this, right? It's got it sprays it out in a lovely little fan, right? It's a very even distribution so that they can see, when it glows evenly, where the distribution of blood is. What we have here is as though Dan George has opened the container and emptied it all over the floor, right? It simply doesn't resemble what you'd expect from a luminol test. And besides which, I mean, not that we can trust them, but the forensic team did deny that they ever conducted a luminol test in that area.
Right. So no satisfactory explanation then from the investigators around that.
No. And again, smeared in with the blood suggests that this is something connected to the event of her death rather than any kind of analysis after the fact.
So we used, like, you opened up with, like, on the balance of probabilities when you first started this, you think Michael may have killed his wife. On the balance of probabilities now, do you still think that would be the case?
Oh no, not at all.
No.
I think really, if you look at the evidence, it's conclusive that, I mean, it's beyond reasonable doubt that a bird was somehow involved in her death. And I do want to make this very clear. This book is not about exonerating Michael Peterson, proving that he's a great guy and we should all love him. This book is simply about how the evidence actually sits for the theory that some bird was involved in Kathleen's death. Now, that I believe you can prove far beyond reasonable doubt. I mean, to the point that any person with a brain should be able to see this is how it unfolded. Anything that you say beyond that point, you're really getting into conjecture. And of course, I had to conjecture further than that as well. I mean, we now start to ask, well, what could explain this event? And that could lead to all sorts of crazy scenarios. Did Michael train a hawk and set it on Kathleen? It's a ridiculous idea, but so was the owl theory, right? So it doesn't actually exonerate Michael, especially because of his behavior, his changing alibi from the start of the case to the end. There's all sorts of suspicious activity going on in this case. And I think most suspicious of all, we should actually ask, how did this case blow up so big? It's not a very interesting story when you think about it.
No.
Did she fall or was she murdered? A tale as old as time. This is not anything particularly interesting. And we might want to ask, well, what motivated this documentary crew to get involved? What motivated this cover-up to take place? I think this case is probably a lot bigger than we really understand at this point. But, again, figuring out why this happened, how it happened, it's going to involve a lot of conjecture, and I'm not sure we can get much further than the facts. And the facts are pretty clear. Kathleen was killed by a bird in her stairwell in her house near Christmas in 2001.
Yeah. Did you manage to speak to Michael or David in any of your research for the book?
No. Failed to make contact with Michael. Failed to make contact with the director of the French docuseries. His agent, found very strange. Failed to make contact with David, who simply ignored all of my requests. Thomas Mayer at least responded to my requests, so he was the other lawyer. And he refused. He at least responded, but he said, I don't think it would be appropriate for me. Comment. Contacted Todd Peterson to try and talk about the case. He blocked me.
Okay.
So there's a real wall of silence around this case. I did manage to talk to Michael's initial lawyer, whose name, once again, it's been a while since the writing of the book escapes me. She was the first to arrive on the scene and document what evidence hadn't been collected and so on. It's a very difficult case to get to the bottom of because of this wall of silence. Now, if you want to know what the opposite of a wall of silence is, talk to Larry Pollard.
He's got a lot to say.
He's got a lot to say, and it's very hard to get a word in edgeways. Which was frustrating because there were a lot of questions that I wanted to ask him, but he was, absolutely intent on listen to my story and sort of going through and telling, but every now and then a question would come in and something enlightening would come out. I think the most interesting thing that Larry, that hadn't really been known before the trial and before this case really went, media crazy, was that the floodlights were lighting up the house that night for the first time in living memory. Larry and Brenda had never seen floodlights lighting up the house before, but on that night, the night that Kathleen died, the house was strongly lit with floodlighting. So I think something unique was happening there that night. At first they thought, they must be having a party, but they didn't hear any noise. They didn't see any people in the windows dancing. So, it's a very, and some people have, really hermited themselves off from this case. So, for example, Christina Tomasetti, who arrived on the scene that night with Todd Peterson, she's done nothing except for change her name. She's moved states, absolute media silence about it. And seems to be, frankly, quite worried about contacting anyone about her role in that case, and quite fearful.
Oh, right. It's interesting. So, what's next for you, Tiddy? What case are you going to look to get into next?
Yeah, I'm not. I'm at that point in my life where things are maybe at a crossroads. I've been teaching philosophy at universities in New Zealand and Asia for the last 10 years or so. I got my PhD in 2017. My master's was from the University of Auckland. And, philosophy had been all I'd been doing. I've published other books, but they're all in philosophy and other articles. They're all in peer-reviewed journals. I took time off to write this book, and now I'm thinking, oh, good grief, what shall I do next? And I might get to that stage in my life where I'm thinking, look, a bakery sounds pretty good.
But thank you very much for talking to me today. Can you just remind me where you can buy the book? Where is it available on Amazon and places like that?
You can buy Death by Talons from the devil himself, Amazon. Yes, you can go and you can purchase it there. You can buy the ebook, the audiobook, the hardback, the paperback. And it was published by Wild Blue Press, who I really can't recommend enough, especially if you're a new true crime writer with an interesting story to tell. They're really going to give you their ear and consider what you want to do very seriously. They're also just a great team, very hardworking, and give you a great deal of personal attention. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you. Thank you for your time today, Tiddy. That was extremely interesting. And yeah, best of luck with whatever's next.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Well, thanks for that, Tiddy. That was a really interesting chat. We covered some really fascinating ideas there. As ever, I want to thank everyone who watches, subscribes, and supports the this YouTube show. So thank you very much. And don't forget, you can buy Tiddy's book direct from the publisher, or you just go onto Amazon, search Death by Talons, and it will come up. It's currently got some really good ratings and reviews. So do check Tiddy's book out. It is excellent. Until next time, I will see you soon.